The calm atmosphere of the first-class cabin was abruptly interrupted. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Either you move to economy, or I'll call security." The voice of the flight attendant rang out with firm authority. A few passengers exchanged curious looks, while others tried to act as if nothing was happening. A couple of people discreetly reached for their phones, sensing an unfolding drama. However, the woman seated in 2A remained unmoved, her demeanor as calm as ever. She wore a sharply tailored black suit that seemed crafted just for her, with no bold jewelry or designer brands, just an understated yet undeniable elegance. Her name? Aria Montgomery, though no one on board knew that just yet. She met the flight attendant's gaze with a quiet confidence. "This is my seat," Aria stated. The attendant, Sophie Harris, crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, but her posture tense with authority. Her uniform was immaculate, and her blonde hair was pulled into a tight knot, as though she were trying to hold everything together. "First class is for priority passengers," Sophie replied, her tone cold and precise. Aria didn't flinch. There was power in her silence. Instead, Aria calmly retrieved her boarding pass from her bag and held it up. Sophie barely glanced at it. "I don't know how you managed this, ma'am, but this is—" She hesitated just a moment too long. "Not where you should be." A thick silence descended on the cabin. A well-dressed gentleman in a dark suit, his hair streaked with gray, leaned forward, intrigued. Other passengers shifted in their seats, sensing this was no ordinary dispute. "I need you to move immediately," Sophie insisted, her patience thinning, "or I'll have security remove you when we land." Aria didn't move an inch. She placed her boarding pass neatly on her tray table and folded her hands in her lap. "No," she replied calmly. The simple word rippled through the air, sending a wave of discomfort through the cabin. A few people avoided looking directly at the confrontation, but they could all feel it. This was more than just about a seat. This was about control, authority, and who decided the rules. Sophie's colleague, a younger attendant named Emma, stood quietly by, glancing between the two women with uncertainty. "Maybe we could just—" Emma began, but Sophie quickly cut her off. "No," Sophie snapped. "This isn't a ticket issue." And there it was. Emma took a small step back, her face pale. The gentleman in the dark suit narrowed his eyes, his curiosity piqued. Aria, undisturbed, reached into her bag again, not for her phone, but for a small leather-bound notebook. She opened it to a fresh page, clicked her pen, and poised it in the air. "What's going on?" Sophie demanded, thrown off by Aria's calm, deliberate action. "Please continue," Aria responded, her tone steady, her presence unyielding. For the first time, Sophie hesitated. But the battle wasn't over yet. Time seemed to stretch. The hum of the engines filled the void as Sophie clenched her jaw, her hand tightening around the beverage cart's handle. Her composure was starting to crack, her grip on control slipping. Aria, however, remained unmoved, her fingers lightly resting on the open page of her notebook, waiting. The surrounding passengers held their breath. The man in the dark suit leaned forward even more. The young man in a hoodie with earbuds draped around his neck subtly angled his phone, recording the tense scene. "Ma'am," Sophie's voice dropped lower, tinged with frustration. "You must follow the crew's instructions." Aria didn't blink. "Which instructions are you referring to?" Sophie's expression faltered, just for a split second. Realizing she was losing ground, she straightened, forced a tight smile, and turned sharply. "I'll handle this differently," she said, walking toward the front of the cabin, pulling the curtains shut behind her. But the tension lingered. Emma stood nearby, fidgeting uncomfortably. Her eyes flickered toward Aria with a silent apology. She knew something wasn't right, but also knew she had no real power to change it. Aria nodded subtly, acknowledging Emma's unspoken understanding. Emma hesitated, then reluctantly followed Sophie to the front. The murmur of conversation began as soon as they were out of sight. "Unbelievable," the man in the dark suit muttered, adjusting his cufflinks. The hoodie-wearing young man smirked, still recording. "You're going viral," he called out to Aria, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Aria didn't respond. She was used to dealing with people who mistook their authority for power. This wasn't about the seat. It never was. A few minutes later, the curtain at the front of the cabin stirred. Sophie emerged, looking even more tense than before, speaking quietly to someone just out of view. A tall, dark-haired male flight attendant stepped into view. His name was Alex, and his sharp features and neatly styled hair gave him an air of authority, but his uncertain glance toward Arya told her everything. He wasn't fully convinced. Sophie whispered something in his ear, urging him on. Alex paused, sighed, and began walking towards seat 2A. "Ma'am," he began, his voice measured and calm, "I just need to verify your seat assignment." Arya locked eyes with him. She pulled her boarding pass from her bag and handed it over. Alex studied it for a moment, let out a small exhale, and nodded. "That's all I needed," he said, turning back toward the galley. Sophie's face darkened as Alex returned to her side. "She's in her assigned seat," Alex said bluntly. Sophie's anger flared, but the words hit like a thunderclap. The passengers around her shifted, murmuring among themselves. The man in the dark suit raised an eyebrow, and the young man with the hoodie grinned wider. Sophie's hands clenched into fists. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophie's voice rang out, overly bright and forced, "beverage service will begin shortly. Please remain seated and enjoy your flight." She grabbed the cart, her fingers gripping it tightly, and began her route down the aisle. As she passed by Arya's row, she paused, eyes fixed on her. "Drink?" The attendant's tone was professional, but there was a sharpness beneath it that hinted at her frustration. "Water," Arya responded, her voice smooth and unwavering. The attendant, Natalie, set the glass down a little too hard, water spilling over the edge. Without a word, she moved on, but Arya, with her quiet precision, steadied the glass, wiping away the spill with a deliberate, calm motion. She wasn't rattled. Far from it. Natalie still believed this was about a fleeting moment of dominance. What she didn't understand was that the real game had been in motion long before they had crossed paths. At the front of the cabin, Natalie whispered fiercely to her colleague, a tall male attendant, his gaze flicking briefly to Arya with clear hesitation. Arya adjusted the cuff of her coat, her movements deliberate, and exhaled slowly. She knew the flight would feel much longer now. The young man in the hoodie, still quietly recording, had not moved his phone. The gentleman in the navy suit continued to observe Natalie's every move. Jessica, the other attendant, did her best to avoid eye contact with Arya. The plane gave a small jolt as turbulence hit, and passengers' grips on their armrests tightened. Arya, however, remained calm, unaffected. Natalie saw her opportunity. With determined steps, she marched back down the aisle and stopped at Arya's seat once more. "Ma'am," Natalie said, her voice tight, "for the last time, are you moving to economy, or do I need to escalate this?" Arya didn't flinch. "I'm exactly where I belong," she answered quietly. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Natalie's professionalism faltered. Her jaw clenched, and her fingers twitched at her side. Passengers leaned in, watching the exchange intently. Realizing she wasn't going to get the result she sought, Natalie's face hardened. "I'll handle this another way," she muttered before turning sharply and heading back to the galley. The tension remained, thick in the air. Passengers exchanged looks, some murmuring among themselves. The intercom crackled to life once more. Natalie's voice, strained but trying to maintain civility, came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be reminded that failure to comply with crew instructions may result in further action upon landing. We appreciate your cooperation." Arya gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It was small, but it was enough. This wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about showing that Natalie was losing control. The murmurs spread. The young man in the hoodie raised his phone higher, no longer hiding the fact that he was recording. Jessica lingered near the galley, her eyes flicking toward Arya as she bit her lip. The plane continued its flight, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Natalie had no clue what was coming next. The last minutes of the flight felt far heavier than the descent. Though the cabin had settled somewhat, The air was still thick with unspoken tension. Natalie had retreated to the galley, her posture rigid, arms crossed tightly in front of her. Her face was neutral, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. Arya remained seated in 2A, perfectly composed. She had dealt with people like Natalie before, those who mistook their position for genuine power. And now, Natalie was realizing the truth. She was no longer in control. A soft murmur spread across the cabin as the intercom crackled again, this time with the captain's firm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please prepare for arrival and remain in your seats." The moment the plane touched the ground, an unmistakable shift ran through the passengers. Seat belts unclicked. Eyes flicked toward the front, expectant. Something was about to unfold. Then the captain's voice returned, steady but commanding. "We ask that all passengers remain seated for a brief moment after landing. There will be a slight delay as airport personnel board the aircraft." The air in the cabin thickened. Passengers exchanged confused, curious glances. Arya remained perfectly still, knowing exactly what was about to happen. As the plane taxied to the gate, two uniformed officers appeared at the front of the cabin. Their presence was undeniable. At the galley, Natalie gripped the counter tightly, her knuckles white. This was not what she had expected. Passengers whispered, some lifting their phones to discreetly capture the unfolding scene. The captain stepped into view, his posture calm but unyielding. His eyes locked on Natalie. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice clear and controlled. "Please come with us." A profound silence descended. Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Her body stiffened, struggling to hold onto the last shred of authority she thought she still had. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice weak, unconvincing. "I didn't." One of the officers interrupted, polite but firm. "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." For the first time that night, Natalie had no retort. Her eyes briefly found Arya, but the other woman's silence spoke volumes. With a final, reluctant hesitation, Natalie stepped away from the galley. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She lifted her chin, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. But deep down, she knew it was over. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of every phone recording her, the stares, the murmurs, the growing realization that her authority had evaporated. When she passed 2A, their eyes met for a brief moment. Natalie's expression was a mix of frustration and unspoken defeat. There was no apology, only the bitter realization that she had made a mistake. Arya's gaze was steady, unblinking, unwavering. And then, Natalie was gone. The moment the cabin door shut behind her, the atmosphere shifted. A single slow clap came from the back of the plane, then another and another, until it spread, soft but growing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a clear acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Passengers started gathering their belongings, the tension slowly lifting, like fog dissipating after a storm. Jessica, the younger attendant, approached Arya's seat. Her voice was softer now, quieter. "I'm sorry about everything," she said. Arya studied her for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You spoke up when it mattered," Arya replied calmly. "That's more than most people do." Jessica swallowed, nodded, and then quickly returned to her duties. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit adjusted his cufflinks and shook his head, still processing what had just happened. "Well," he muttered, "that was something." Arya didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. She had nothing to prove. As she stepped off the plane, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about standing her ground, asserting her place, and showing that some things can't be taken away. Not by force, not by authority, but by quiet certainty. This wasn't just a battle for a seat. It was about knowing where you belong, even when others try to decide for you. Stories like this remind us of the importance of speaking up, standing firm, and never letting others diminish our worth. And as the flight crew cleared the plane, one thing was certain. In moments like these, sometimes the most powerful act is simply being unshaken.